Imagine being crowned queen while already condemned. Imagine smiling for the court while every corridor whispers your name like a verdict. Imagine realizing that love, in a palace built on power, is not romance at all, but evidence. This is not the story of Catherine Howard's reign. This is the story of her ending. Slow, inevitable, and far more terrifying than the axe that would eventually fall. Before we go any further, if you're drawn to stories that peel back royal glamour and expose the raw psychology of power, betrayal, and survival, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the History Veil, and share it with someone who believes history is only about crowns and victories. Some stories are meant to be remembered because they warn us. Catherine Howard was never meant to be queen. She was young, poorly educated, and raised in a household where supervision was optional and danger was normal. In the Duke of Norfolk's home, rules existed in name only. Doors were left unlocked. Privacy was abundant. And for a girl with beauty and no protection, attention came early and often. Catherine learned, long before court ever saw her, that affection could be currency and secrecy could feel like safety. By the time she entered Henry VIII's court as a lady-in-waiting to Anne of Cleves, Catherine had already lived a life the court would later call scandalous. Relationships with Henry Manox and Frances Dereham were not whispered fantasies. They were real, physical, remembered by others. And memory, in Tudor England, was never private for long. Henry VIII noticed her immediately. She was everything he was not anymore. Young, lively, uncomplicated. After years of political marriages and personal humiliation, Catherine felt like renewal. He pursued her with intensity that masked itself as devotion. When Anne of Cleves was set aside, Catherine was elevated with shocking speed. At around 17, she became Queen of England. The court celebrated. Henry indulged. Jewels, gowns, feasts. Catherine played her role well, smiling brightly beside a king who believed he had reclaimed youth itself. But beneath the silken ceremony, Catherine was standing on unstable ground. The past does not disappear when you change titles. It waits. From the moment Catherine became queen, she was being watched. Not just by enemies, but by those closest to her. In Tudor politics, proximity is danger. Every servant hears something. Every friend knows something. And secrets do not stay loyal. Catherine did not fully understand this world. She continued to rely on familiar faces. She brought Frances Dereham back into her household, perhaps believing loyalty would protect her. Instead, it placed a witness inside her walls. Later, she allowed Thomas Culper, a favored courtier, into her private spaces. Whether love or recklessness drove her, the result was the same. She gave the court what it always waits for. Evidence. Rumors began as they always do. Quietly. A look held too long. A servant dismissed too often. Letters passed discreetly. In a court trained to detect weakness, Catherine's youth made her vulnerable. She did not build alliances. She did not protect herself with distance. She trusted familiarity in a place that devoured trust. Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, received the accusation carefully. He did not confront the Queen directly. He presented the information to Henry as concern, not certainty. This was crucial. Henry was not just a husband. He was a king who despised humiliation. To accuse his queen was to accuse his judgment. Henry reacted with disbelief, then rage, then something worse. Silence. Catherine was arrested quietly. No public scandal. No immediate execution. She was moved from palace to palace, questioned repeatedly, her household dismantled piece by piece. Each interrogation peeled away another layer of protection. Witnesses were brought forward. Old relationships were resurrected. Statements were recorded. Catherine's past was no longer hers. It belonged to the state. The psychological cruelty of this period cannot be overstated. Catherine was not immediately condemned. She was made to wait. To remember. To realize that every moment of her life was being reconstructed by men who had already decided what it meant. She was isolated, stripped of royal comforts, and forced to confront how little power the crown had ever given her. Henry did not see her. Not once. This absence was deliberate. In Tudor justice, denial of presence was punishment. Catherine was no longer worthy of the king's anger, only his judgment. Parliament moved swiftly. Adultery for a queen was not personal betrayal. It was treason. To share a body with someone other than the king was to threaten the succession itself. Catherine's defenders were few and ineffective. Youth was not a defense. Ignorance was not mercy. Her family distanced themselves. The same uncle who had celebrated her rise now remained silent. Survival in Tudor politics depended on separation from the condemned. As winter closed in, Catherine was transferred to the Tower of London. Not yet to die, but to understand that she would. Former queens had walked those walls before her. And Boleyn's shadow lingered in every stone. Catherine reportedly wandered her rooms in distress, rehearsing prayers, clinging to memories of moments when she had felt safe. On the night before her execution, she is said to have practiced placing her head on the block. Whether literal or symbolic, the image endures because it captures the final psychological horror. Acceptance forced through fear. Preparation not for life, but for obedience in death. Catherine Howard was executed in February 1542. She was likely no older than 19. Her death was swift. The years that led to it were not. Her story is often told as a cautionary tale about foolishness or immorality. That framing is convenient. It shifts blame away from the system that placed a child into a lethal role and called it honor. Catherine was not destroyed by passion alone. She was destroyed by a court that consumed youth and punished vulnerability. This is only the beginning of her final days. Because what happened next reveals how power cleans its hands after blood is spilled, and how history decides who deserves sympathy and who becomes a lesson. Catherine Howard's world began to shrink the moment the accusations were taken seriously. Not announced. Not shouted. Simply accepted. In Tudor England, once suspicion reached the king's inner circle, the outcome was rarely in doubt. The only question was how long the process would take, and how much fear would be extracted along the way. She was moved again, quietly, from palace to palace. The rooms grew colder. The servants fewer. Familiar faces vanished overnight. Each relocation was deliberate. Disorientation was part of the method. Catherine was never told exactly what evidence existed, only that more was coming. Names were mentioned casually, then withdrawn. Silence filled the gaps. Silence is far more effective than shouting. Interrogations followed a careful rhythm. Questions were not framed to discover truth, but to construct it. Catherine was asked to recount her past again and again, each retelling measured against witness statements already collected. Memory became a trap. Any inconsistency was treated as proof of guilt. Any consistency was treated as confirmation. Francis Derham was arrested and questioned first. He did not protect her. Under pressure, he spoke openly about their relationship before her marriage. He described promises, language that implied precontract. In Tudor law, a precontract could invalidate a royal marriage, transforming Catherine's queenship into fraud. What mattered was not love, but legality. The crown does not forgive embarrassment. Thomas Culper's arrest sealed her fate. His access to Catherine, his proximity, his letters. These were not interpreted as affection. They were interpreted as threat. A queen's body was not her own. It belonged to the succession. To compromise it was treason. Catherine was never allowed to frame her own story. Others did it for her. Male voices. Clerical voices. Legal voices. She existed only as an object of inquiry. Her emotions were irrelevant. Her fear was unrecorded. The court was not interested in why she acted, only in how her actions could be categorized. Henry VIII remained absent. This absence carried enormous weight. Catherine wrote to him, pleading, explaining, begging for mercy. Her letters were emotional, desperate, human. They were also useless. Henry had learned from Anne Boleyn's fall that personal involvement complicated execution. Distance simplified judgment. Parliament moved swiftly. A special bill of attainder was prepared, removing the need for a formal trial. Trials invite defense. Attainders declare conclusions. Catherine was accused not only of adultery, but of concealing her past from the king. This mattered more. The law was amended retroactively to make her behavior treasonous. Rules changed because power required it. Her youth offered no protection. In fact, it worked against her. The court framed her as reckless, uncontrolled, morally weak. Innocence was reinterpreted as danger. A young queen without restraint was seen as a destabilizing force. Execution became not punishment, but correction. Meanwhile, those associated with her were eliminated efficiently. Derham was executed brutally. Culper followed. Their deaths were public, violent, instructive. Catherine was forced to understand what awaited her, not through threat, but through example. Fear was administered indirectly. When Catherine was taken to the Tower of London, it was not as a spectacle. It was as procedure. The same fortress that had housed her cousin Anne Boleyn now received her quietly. History repeated itself without ceremony. The Tower was not just a prison. It was a psychological instrument. Every stone carried memory. She was housed in rooms overlooking the scaffold where Anne Boleyn had died. Whether intentional or not, the symbolism was unavoidable. Catherine was reported to be hysterical at first, crying uncontrollably, begging guards for information, for reassurance, for mercy. None came. Gradually, panic gave way to something else. Realization. This stage is often overlooked, but it is crucial. Catherine began to understand that survival was no longer an option. There would be no trial in which she could speak freely. No last-minute pardon. No romantic intervention. The system had already moved past her. Accounts suggest that Catherine spent her final days in prayer. She requested instruction on how to die well. This detail is often presented as piety. It was also preparation. Tudor executions were public performances. The condemned were expected to display composure, repentance, obedience. Dying badly could tarnish memory. Catherine was being coached for her final role. She reportedly practiced laying her head on the block. The image is disturbing not because of its violence, but because of its compliance. A teenage girl rehearsing her own death to ensure she performed it correctly. Power had succeeded in one final way. It had transformed terror into discipline. Henry VIII signed the death warrant without seeing her. This was not indifference. It was control. To acknowledge Catherine would be to admit vulnerability. Kings do not apologize to history. They write it. On the morning of her execution, Catherine dressed carefully. Witnesses described her as calm, composed. This calm should not be mistaken for courage alone. It was exhaustion. The kind that follows prolonged fear. When there is no longer any hope, fear loses purpose. She addressed the crowd briefly, accepting responsibility, asking forgiveness, affirming loyalty to the king. These words were expected. Deviating from them would have changed nothing. Compliance was the final currency she possessed. When the executioner's blade fell, Catherine Howard ceased to exist as a political problem. The court moved on immediately. Another queen would follow. Another story would be written. What remained was a narrative. Catherine became a lesson. A warning against female sexuality. Against youth without restraint. Against intimacy in the wrong place. Her story was simplified, moralized, stripped of context. The court had no interest in examining how it had placed a child into a lethal role. Blame was more convenient than reflection. This is how systems survive their own cruelty. They redefine victims as causes. But Catherine's death did not resolve the tension beneath Tudor power. It exposed it. A monarchy so fragile that it could not tolerate vulnerability. A court so obsessed with order that it destroyed those who disrupted its image. A king so fearful of humiliation that he erased it with blood. The axe ended Catherine's life. It did not end the question her story raises. How many lives are consumed to preserve the illusion of stability? That question haunted the Tudor court long after her body was buried beside Anne Boleyn's in an unmarked grave. And it is the question that brings us closer to understanding why Catherine Howard was never truly seen as a queen, but as a problem to be solved. Because what came after her death reveals how power cleanses itself, and how history decides which suffering deserves sympathy and which becomes silence. And that is where this story continues. After Catherine Howard's execution, the court did what it always did best. It erased. Curtains were changed. Chambers reassigned. Names stopped being spoken aloud. The Tudor court had learned long ago that survival depended on speed. Grief lingered too long could look like sympathy, and sympathy could look like disloyalty. Henry VIII remarried within months. This is not a detail meant to shock. It is a mechanism meant to reveal something colder. Catherine's death was not a rupture in the system. It was maintenance. Once the problem was removed, normality resumed. The machinery of power does not pause for reflection. It recalibrates and moves forward. Official narratives followed quickly. Catherine was described as reckless, immoral, unfit. Her youth was reframed as irresponsibility. Her vulnerability became weakness. The court needed a story that justified what it had done without implicating itself. And so Catherine became a warning, not a victim. This transformation mattered. Because once a person becomes a lesson, their humanity becomes optional. Writers and preachers emphasized obedience. Women were reminded that modesty preserved safety. That silence protected honor. Catherine's fate was held up as proof of what happened when boundaries were crossed. The deeper truth, that a teenager had been elevated beyond her capacity and then destroyed for failing to survive it, was carefully avoided. Henry VIII never publicly expressed regret. Privately, some chroniclers noted that he was troubled. that he experienced moments of melancholy. But regret is not the same as responsibility. Henry did not question the system that had placed him above consequence. He did not examine the culture that rewarded informants, punished intimacy, and treated queens as political instruments first and human beings second. Instead, the court focused on continuity. Catherine was buried in the Tower of London, beneath the chapel floor, near Anne Boleyn. No marker. No ceremony. Two queens reduced to silence beneath stone. Their proximity in death feels symbolic, but it was practical. The tower kept its secrets close. Over time, Catherine's story hardened into caricature. She became the foolish queen. The promiscuous girl. These labels served a purpose. They made her death feel avoidable. And if it was avoidable, then the system was not cruel. It was corrective. But this interpretation collapses under scrutiny. Catherine did not create the conditions of her rise. She did not choose a king 3 times her age. She did not design a court that weaponized intimacy. She did not invent laws that defined a queen's body as state property. She entered a world that demanded perfection and punished learning. Her tragedy was not that she failed to be virtuous. It was that virtue offered no protection. This becomes clearer when we examine who benefited from her death. Henry benefited. His authority remained intact. His masculinity, wounded by public embarrassment, was restored through decisive violence. The court benefited. Rivals were removed. Order was reinforced. Parliament benefited. Its power to redefine treason was expanded. Everyone who mattered emerged safer. Everyone except Catherine. And this is the pattern that repeats throughout history. Individuals are sacrificed to preserve the appearance of stability. Their stories are simplified until the cost feels reasonable. Memory becomes selective. Sympathy becomes dangerous. Centuries later, historians began to revisit Catherine's life with more nuance. They examined her age, her upbringing, the absence of guidance. They questioned whether consent meant the same thing for a teenage girl raised without supervision and then thrust into absolute power. These questions do not change her fate. But they change how we understand responsibility. Understanding matters. Because Catherine Howard's story is not just about Tudor England. It is about systems that elevate youth for appearance and punish it for vulnerability. About institutions that demand loyalty without offering protection. About how easily morality becomes a weapon in the hands of power. The court insisted Catherine's execution preserved order. But order preserved through fear is fragile. It requires constant reinforcement. And it teaches those within it to hide, to lie, to betray before they are betrayed. The Tudor court did not become safer after Catherine's death. It became more cautious, more suspicious, more brittle. Henry VIII would execute or discard others. He would continue to rule through intimidation. And yet, his reign would be remembered not for peace, but for turbulence. Wives beheaded. Religious upheaval. Political paranoia. Catherine's death did not stabilize the court. It exposed how unstable it already was. This is the quiet irony of power exercised without restraint. It achieves immediate obedience and long-term corrosion. Catherine Howard is often compared to Anne Boleyn. Both young. Both executed. Both blamed. But there is a difference. Anne challenged power. Catherine never did. Anne was politically active. Catherine was politically naive. And yet, the outcome was the same. This tells us something important. In systems like the Tudor court, innocence is not safety. Ignorance is not mercy. Vulnerability is not forgiven. It is exploited. The final cruelty is how Catherine's story has been remembered. Not as a tragedy of imbalance, but as a morality tale. History prefers lessons that flatter authority. It struggles with truths that implicate structure rather than behavior. But Catherine Howard was not destroyed by passion alone. She was destroyed by a court that confused control with order and punishment with justice. A court that demanded perfection from a child and called it governance. When we strip away the romance, the scandal, and the sermons, what remains is a human cost that cannot be justified by law or tradition. A young woman who never learned how dangerous her world was until it was too late. Her death closed one chapter, but it did not resolve the tension beneath Tudor power. It left a question lingering in silence, the kind that history avoids but never answers. How many lives must be broken to preserve the illusion of stability? That question did not die with Catherine Howard. It followed the Tudor dynasty. It followed every system that mistakes authority for morality. And in the final part of this story, we confront what Catherine's end reveals about how history chooses who deserves compassion, and who becomes a warning. Because the most disturbing part of Catherine Howard's story is not how she died. It is how easily her death was explained away. Long after Catherine Howard's body was lowered into the ground beneath the Tower Chapel, the Tudor court continued exactly as it always had. That continuation is the final cruelty of her story. Power does not mourn what it consumes. It absorbs, rationalizes, and moves on. Catherine's death solved a problem, not a question. The question was far more dangerous. Official memory hardened quickly. Chronicles reduced her to a mistake. A girl who did not understand restraint. A queen who embarrassed the crown. This framing was essential. If Catherine was foolish, then her death was inevitable. If she was immoral, then her execution was corrective. Responsibility shifted neatly away from the system that elevated and destroyed her. But systems reveal themselves most clearly in their aftermath. Henry VIII married again, seeking stability through repetition. Each marriage promised order and delivered anxiety. Trust eroded. Surveillance increased. Informants flourished. The court learned that intimacy was liability. Silence became safety. Catherine's fate did not protect women at court. It trained them to disappear. What Catherine never had, and what history rarely grants her, is context. She entered the court as a teenager from a household defined by neglect, not guidance. She was noticed not for intellect or preparation, but for youth. She was elevated not because she was capable, but because she was convenient. And when convenience turned into vulnerability, she was discarded. This is not an individual failing. It is structural. The Tudor court demanded that a queen embody perfection while denying her education, autonomy, and protection. It demanded loyalty while rewarding betrayal. It demanded obedience while offering no mercy for mistakes learned too late. Catherine did not fail this system. The system was designed to fail her. Her story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about power and gender. When authority is absolute, morality becomes selective. Youth becomes expendable. And vulnerability becomes evidence. Catherine Howard is often contrasted with Anne Boleyn, but the comparison obscures a deeper pattern. Anne challenged power and paid with her life. Catherine never challenged anything and paid the same price. In such systems, resistance is not required for destruction. Presence is enough. After Catherine, the court grew more cautious, not more humane. Fear sharpened behavior. Trust vanished. The illusion of stability was maintained through vigilance rather than confidence. Henry VIII ruled longer, but he ruled alone, surrounded by people trained to hide truth until it became accusation. This is the legacy Catherine leaves behind. Not scandal, but exposure. Exposure of a court that consumed youth to reassure aging power. Exposure of laws that defined intimacy as treason and silence as virtue. Exposure of a culture that punished women for conditions it created. History often prefers clean lessons. Catherine's story is uncomfortable because it offers none. There is no redemption in her death. No balance restored. Only a quiet continuation of the same forces that condemned her. And yet, remembrance itself is resistance. To remember Catherine Howard as more than a warning is to refuse the court's narrative. It is to see her not as a moral failure, but as a human being placed inside an impossible role. It is to recognize that systems which demand perfection without protection do not produce order. They produce casualties. Catherine was not destroyed by love alone. She was destroyed by a world that weaponized memory, punished learning, and confused authority with justice. Her final days were not just tragic. They were instructive. They show us how easily power explains itself after violence. How quickly sympathy is redirected into blame. How history is shaped to protect structures rather than people. This is why Catherine Howard's story endures. Not because she was careless. Not because she was scandalous. But because she reveals what happens when a system elevates youth for display and punishes it for being human. Her life was brief. Her death was swift. The conditions that created both lasted far longer. And if there is any justice left to history, it is this. Catherine Howard was not a lesson to be learned. She was a cost to be counted. Catherine Howard's story does not truly end with her execution, or even with the quiet continuation of the Tudor court. It ends much later, in the way history chooses what to forgive and what to forget. And in that choice, we learn far more about power than about Catherine herself. For centuries, her name survived mostly as shorthand. The careless queen. The foolish girl. The wife who could not control herself. These labels were repeated so often that they began to feel like facts. But repetition is not truth. It is convenience. And convenience has always served authority better than honesty. Catherine Howard was never given the chance to define herself. Not in life, and not in death. Others defined her at every stage. As a girl, she was defined by neglect. As a young woman, by male attention. As a queen, by expectation. And finally, as a criminal, by a legal system designed to protect the crown, not the person wearing it. This is why her story feels so unsettling even now. Because once you remove the Tudor costumes and royal titles, the structure remains familiar. A young person elevated too quickly. A system that rewards appearance over preparation. A culture that mistakes vulnerability for guilt. And an institution that punishes failure without examining the conditions that made failure inevitable. Catherine did not live long enough to grow into power. She lived just long enough to be consumed by it. Modern historians have tried to rehabilitate her image, but even that effort reveals how deep the original narrative runs. She is often defended by emphasizing her age, her lack of education, her environment. These defenses matter. But they also highlight something darker. That sympathy must be earned through explanation. That a victim must justify why they deserve compassion. Power never has to explain itself. Its victims always do. The Tudor court framed Catherine's death as restoration of order. But order restored through fear does not heal instability. It conceals it. And concealment requires constant reinforcement. This is why the Tudor reign remained tense, suspicious, and violent long after Catherine was gone. The system that killed her did not become safer. It became more brittle. Henry VIII died years later, surrounded by ceremony but isolated by his own authority. His legacy is not stability, but rupture. Religious upheaval. Political paranoia. A trail of destroyed relationships. Catherine Howard was not an anomaly in his reign. She was a symptom. What makes her story especially haunting is how little resistance it contains. Catherine did not lead a faction. She did not challenge policy. She did not attempt to manipulate succession. Her greatest crime was trusting familiarity in a place where intimacy was dangerous. And for that, she paid with her life. This reveals a crucial truth about absolute systems. They do not require rebellion to destroy you. They require proximity. To be close to power is to be visible. To be visible is to be vulnerable. And when power feels threatened, it does not distinguish between intention and inconvenience. Catherine's execution taught the court how to behave. Silence became survival. Emotional restraint became armor. Women learned to disappear within their roles. Men learned to document, accuse, and distance themselves quickly. The court functioned, but it did not breathe. This is the hidden cost of maintaining authority through fear. It produces compliance, not loyalty. Performance, not trust. And over time, it hollows out the very institution it seeks to protect. Catherine Howard's true legacy is not scandal. It is exposure. Exposure of a court that treated young women as symbols rather than people. Exposure of laws that could be rewritten overnight to legitimize violence. Exposure of a culture that demanded perfection while denying guidance. And perhaps most importantly, exposure of how easily history cooperates with power. Because Catherine was easier to remember as foolish than to acknowledge as trapped. Easier to moralize than to understand. Easier to turn into a warning than to confront as a cost. But remembering her honestly does something powerful. It breaks the illusion that authority is neutral. It reminds us that systems are made by people, and people choose what they protect. It forces us to ask whether order built on fear is worth the lives it consumes. Catherine Howard was not innocent because she was perfect. She was innocent because she was human in a system that punished humanity. Her tragedy was not a failure of character. It was a failure of protection. History often tells us that the past was cruel because it was ignorant. Catherine's story suggests something else. That cruelty is often fully aware. It simply decides that the price is acceptable. And that is why her story still matters. Not because she was a queen. Not because she was young. But because she shows us how power behaves when it is embarrassed, threatened, and unchallenged. Her life reminds us that being close to power without protection is one of the most dangerous positions a human being can occupy. And her death reminds us that when systems are never forced to account for their victims, they repeat themselves. Catherine Howard did not leave behind reforms, speeches, or victories. She left behind a question. How many lives must be broken to preserve the appearance of order? History has never answered that question comfortably. It has only demonstrated it again and again. And that is why Catherine Howard should not be remembered as a lesson in morality. She should be remembered as evidence.